Peter is the director of the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution here at Teachers College. He's also an associate professor of psychology and education. He's also a member of the faculty at Columbia University's Earth Institute and the chair of the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, otherwise known as AC4 here at Columbia. His research interests include intractable conflict, complexity theory and conflict, identity formation, moral emotions, ripeness and conflict, in-group and out-group formation, the mediation of interethnic conflict, and the processes that foster the constructive use of social power. Dr. Coleman co-edits the Handbook of Conflict Resolution Theory and Practice with Dr. Deutsch and Eric Marcus on the 2006 version, and has authored over 50 journal articles and chapters. In 2003, he became the first recipient of the Early Career Award from the APA Division 48, the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence. His recent book, The 5%, Finding Solutions for Seemingly Impossible Conflicts, was published earlier this year and has garnered interest and attention at academic institutions, in applied peace-building and conflict resolution organizations, and in the media, including the blogosphere. Dr. Coleman will speak about rethinking intractable conflict, the perspective of dynamical systems, tackling the great debate.
So there are two chapters in the book that myself and my co-authors, Robin Valacher and Andrzej Nowak, and Lam Boy-Ryshinska contributed to. One is the work on intractable conflict, which was previously published in the American Psychologist. And the final chapter, which I want to talk about for a couple of minutes, is called Tackling the Great Debate, Nature, Nurture, Consistency, and the Basic Dimensions of Social Relations. And this, as I had said earlier, is a response to one of Morton Deutsch's most ambitious intellectual undertakings. And so I just want to give a little context to it and talk about how we've worked with his model of psychological orientation and social relations. So the field of social psychology has long had a sort of split personality disorder. From the very early roots, the discipline either was conceptualized from an environmental perspective, like what in situations are driving people, or from the personality perspective, what aspects of the person are driving people. Even the first textbook in social psychology was penned by a sociologist, Ross, in 1908, but by 1970, half of the textbooks were penned by sociologists who were talking about the environment, and half were penned by psychologists who were talking about the personality. So there was this sort of debate, and even if you go back to our ancient philosophical forefathers of the discipline, Plato and Aristotle, they were at odds over whether there was a social contract theory offered the best explanation of the social nature of humans, or whether a more instinctual political animal view that Aristotle argued best captured it. And this tug of war between whether social situations or people are responsible for our behaviors continues today in the flagship journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which sort of keeps them to some degree separate. Now this division in social psychology, of course, reflected a debate raging within the broader domain of science regarding the relative importance of nature versus nurture in our physical and social worlds. The divide was addressed initially by Darwin in the mid-1800s when he started to introduce ideas of evolutionary concepts, individual environmental fit and adaptation, and later Lewin addressed the issue in psychology, suggesting that neither instincts or situations accounted for what people did, but it was some kind of interaction between the two. And that general framework, interactive framework, many of you have been subjected to it in my class and other classes, which is behavior as a function of person times environment. It has influenced a lot of theorizing since that time, although it didn't put the great debate to rest. Still to this day, there are attacks on personality psychology, etc. So Morton Deutsch then entered, a student of Lewin's, and he too was influenced by this interaction framework of looking at both and how the person and the environment and how they would interact, but ultimately considered it somewhat wanting, that it was still very general and crude, and he wanted to better specify exactly what was operating and how it was operating. So in the 70s, he, with Wish and Kaplan, set out to map the basic dimensions of all interpersonal relations, right? So he wanted to understand in any kind of relationship, what are the basic fundamental dimensions that are operating there that are meaningful and affect how people respond to the relationships and experience them. And so they did this ambitious study and identified a coherent and sort of simple set of these variables. And subsequently, Deutsch took those fundamental dimensions and worked with them to create his model, his theory of psychological orientations and social relations. Now, the theory was aimed really to sort of take Lewin's framework and move it forward by really trying to understand, well, what are the dimensions in the environment that are in social relations that are affecting people, and how do they specifically interact with people's personalities to influence what they did. So it is an ambitious model. It's a brilliant model, I would suggest. But despite this attempt at theoretical reconciliation of the two sides, or maybe because of it, the contribution laid somewhat dormant for decades, neglected by a field perhaps that was very invested in its own divisions of situations and personalities. But what we're suggesting in this chapter is that the time is very ripe to take up Lewin and Deutsch seriously and to sort of finally heal our field's lingering, dissociative identity disorder. So what we do in the book is lay out the specifics of Mort's model and his theory, which he himself recently has written that it needs conceptual refinement and empirical study, but is a critical framework for understanding how people and environments interact and affect each other over time. And we have been applying the basic framework to understand conflict dynamics, and to understand conflict dynamics in the context situated in relationships. So instead of conflicts as, again, being driven by specifics of situations or individuals, how do these elements interact over time? And what are the dynamics that the model sheds light on? So we've been working in this area probably about 8-10 years, have published a variety of things on it, are working on a book on this right now, and the work that is informed by Mort's model is described in this book as an illustration of how the framework that he offered on psychological orientation and interdependence offers tremendous value and utility for trying to make sense of aspects of different fields in psychology that are difficult to make sense of. For example, in research on individual differences in negotiation and conflict resolution, the findings are kind of all over the place. You would think that things like gender, things like how cooperative or competitive people are chronically would matter, but the research, in fact, is kind of all over the place, and it's because there are these strong interactions happening. And so the model helps give us insight into how those interactions are playing out and the implications of that for understanding our research and conducting further research. So what I want to suggest is that you invest in the book and read Deutsch's original conceptualization of psychological orientation and interdependence, and then the follow-up chapter, which gives an illustration of the application of it. And then those of you who are students here who are looking for ripe areas to work in, this is a powerful model with a lot of promise and potential that you can take forward into your work, right? Very good. Okay, that's I think what we'll do is invite Professor Deutsch to come up and make a few comments. And
let me just say that I won't comment on either the chapters or the presentations. Actually, in the book, you will find written comments by me on the individual chapters. So if you want to read those comments, they're in the book. Let me just say my thanks to Peter for initiating the book, editing the book, and organizing this gala. I appreciate it very much. And let me say, none of this theoretical work and so on would have happened if Lydia hadn't typed my dissertation. And let that if my parents had been here, my mother would have been delighted by the warmth of the presentation for me. My father would have been astonished. I'm not going to talk so much about the past, but just to indicate what I'm currently involved in. Peter and I are editing a book on the psychological components of a sustainable peace. And I've written a chapter for that book called something like an intellectual framework for thinking about developing a global community. And as I wrote it, I became more and more concerned, frankly, about the need for a global community. We face important problems in this planet, and all of the people will be affected by these problems unless we cooperate together as a global community. So my concern with that issue has led me to think about developing at Columbia an intellectual community that will be concerned about fostering ideas and thinking about a global community. And Jim Westby, I don't know if he's here, is joined with me, and Hakeem Williams and Christy Gutsy, and now Eric Marcus have joined with me to start developing plans on how we can build such a community. And we have very ambitious plans. We're thinking first of getting people from AC4 to maybe join us in developing these plans. And then we're thinking of maybe having a multidisciplinary conference, not only psychologists, economists, political scientists, artists, poets, a variety of disciplines who can contribute to this. And then we're thinking of having something very public for the whole community. Try to get more people involved in this, and to help them understand the importance of the issue. And then a continuing seminar or institute which will focus on this. So I'm ambitious, and Jim and I and Christy and all the others, we're ambitious. So if you want to join us, and you really want to work, we'll be happy. Just get in touch with me. And let's go and have some wine.